So in the 1980s, A&W Root Beer came out with the third, they basically call it the third pound burger or something like that. Anybody remember something like that? Okay? Yes, he's like, I had about, how many did you have? It was 3/9. That's how they kind of said it was 3/9 of a burger, but they did that in the 1980s to rival the quarter pounder at McDonald's. Any quarter pounder fans in here? Okay? So they did that to rival, to say, hey, can we get up with McDonald's in this? The third burger, the third pounder they called it. You can see here. It's bigger, it's genius. But you want to know what? It failed. It failed. This is why it failed, according to their leaders. The third pounder failed because the average person did not understand fractions. So it failed, and so what they did as a leadership was, they said, let's get together focus groups, and let's see what these people say. The average person said that with a quarter pounder, they associate the number what? 4. The third pounder, they associated with what number? 4 is bigger than 3. It must be a bigger sandwich. Now, to us sitting here this morning, we're like, dude, these people are stupid. Why wouldn't I want that much more meat? And what A&W Root Beer did was said, how large can we go in a burger to make it a similar price point and still make a lot of money? And that's what they came to realize, was that if they offered the third pounder, they could rival this, but it failed because of how people perceived it and how people understood what it was. We can sit here and say, silly people, but how often do we look at the same things in life and not understand what's happening in front of us? Today we're going to see several stories that really is a larger linking story. Beginning in Mark chapter 6, we're going to end in Mark chapter 8, and we're going to see Jesus interacting with his disciples about whether they understand what he's doing in their life or not. This story begins with maybe a familiar story that you've heard, the feeding of the 5,000. This story begins in Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 30. And this story goes off that Jesus took his disciples and they go off to a quiet place. But Jesus, being so well known for his miracles and everything else he's been doing, people follow him. So Jesus begins to teach them, and they are so far away that it was late in the afternoon. And Jesus says, we got to go get something for them to eat. Well, the disciples said that to Jesus, And Jesus is like, well, you guys feed them. Like, with what? With all this people here, we'd have to work for months to feed all these people. That's what we'd have to do. So Jesus kind of sends them out on a scouting trip, and he's like, well, how much food do you have? Well, we got 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And in that moment, Jesus does the miraculous, where he multiplies that meal and he feeds everyone present. They say 5,000 men and their families were fed. But it also gives us keen insight to what's happening here. He kept giving bread to the disciples so that they could distribute it to the people. So the disciples see here in this moment, they have not enough food to feed people. To get enough food to feed people, they'd have to work months and months and months. But in this moment, Jesus takes 5 loaves and 2 fishes, miraculously multiplies them, and the disciples get to be a part of this by passing out what was there. They got to distribute this miracle right in front of everyone else. They got to be a part of it. But this is where we're going to jump now. Mark chapter 6, verse 47. This is gone by. The disciples go. Remember we talked about last week. Across the lake, across back the lake, across back the lake. That's what Mark does. Verse 47. Late that night, the disciples were in the boat in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on the land. He saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard and struggling against the wind and waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. Now that probably blows all of our minds right there. It says he was walking on the water. He intended to go past them, but when they saw him walking on the water, they cried out in terror, thinking he was a ghost. Verse 50, They were all terrified when they saw him, but Jesus spoke to them at once and said, "Don't be afraid. Take courage. I'm here." Then he climbed into the boat, and the winds stopped. And then it says this. So keep there, right? It stopped. This is the rest of verse 51 now. They were totally amazed, for they didn't understand the significance of the miracle of the loaves, because their hearts were too hard to take it in. It's one of the most powerful verses there. They were amazed that Jesus was walking on the water. Why? Because they didn't get the significance of the miracle of the loaves and fishes, because their hearts were too hard to take it in. You see, when we piece back to last Sunday in Mark chapter 6, last week we looked at these people who were amazed yet didn't believe. Now we find, a little bit later on in Mark chapter 6, we find people, the disciples, who were amazed yet didn't understand. Let's ask ourselves this morning. Should the disciples have been amazed that Jesus could walk on water? Should they have been? What do we think? Yes? In the human. Okay. In the human, maybe. But don't you think if they were just a part of this absolutely mind-blowing thing, that you'd think, of course he can do that. Why couldn't he do that? We saw him heal the man get lowered through the roof. We saw him heal the woman who had the blood disorder for 12 years. We saw, because Peter told us that he went in with Jesus, that he took this little girl who died and raised her from the hand. And yet we're still amazed that Jesus could walk on water. And we still don't get the miracle that just happened right in front of our own eyes. This word understand goes like this. They couldn't piece together in their hearts what happened. It was funny this morning having a conversation with a couple of gentlemen here about puzzles. But this is ultimately the picture here. That it's a bunch of puzzle pieces scattered, and they have no ability to analyze or come to a conclusion about what the full picture actually looks like. It's basically like getting a puzzle that comes together, but it has no picture to it. And you're like, what am I supposed to be putting together? And that's ultimately what they saw in their hearts. They saw a bunch of things scattered, but they couldn't piece together what Jesus was doing in their midst. Now again, I think about this and I say, how can they not get this? When we go back to this idea of a kairos moment is when God steps into our time. Right? It's not planned. They were just a part of a miracle, and they did not understand. They could not piece together what Jesus was doing. Do we understand that this morning? Do we understand the depth of that this morning? They literally were a part of a miracle. I don't know about you, but when all this food keeps on showing up out of nowhere, don't you think you're like, what is going on? This is absolutely incredible. We know this guy can do this. Of course, why couldn't he? Why did we even say we had to work for months? We should have said, yeah, Jesus, do your thing. Show up. And yet they still couldn't piece together why. What's the text say? Why couldn't they piece it together? Because what? Their hearts were what? They're hardened. Do we see the book of Mark coming together now, right? We went to Mark chapter 4, the parable of the sower. And the first was the footpath. That was too hard when the seed landed on it and it was snatched away by the birds. Or Jesus, when he explained it to his disciples, Satan comes and snatches it away. Why? Because it has no room at all, because it's so hard. In this translation of the word, it's actually the word for a callus. So when I lift weights, that's one thing that my hand grows right here is calluses that look like this. No, this is not a picture of my hand, but it's just as ugly as this. But this is what this word means. It says when there's friction on something, it grows a callus. There's a lot of things in life that harden our hearts. And because life hardens our hearts, we miss out on what Jesus is doing in our lives because of the condition of our heart. And what we often do is we blame other things. We'll say it's because of this or because of that or because of this, when ultimately it's the condition of our heart. We have a heart that is calloused in our lives. A heart that is calloused. And we've seen this to be a theme between the condition of our heart, what we see Jesus doing, the condition of our heart, and how we grow in belief. And so as we begin to see these stories begin to connect even more, what don't you understand that Jesus is doing in your midst because of the condition of your heart? What do I not understand? What don't I understand? All right, flip your Bibles, Mark chapter 8. We're going to see these stories connect again. Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 1, begins with the feeding of the 4,000. Now we see Jesus at this point again. They run out of food. Jesus calls the disciples. He says, I feel sorry for these people. They've been here for me for days. They have nothing left to eat. If I send them home hungry and faint, if I send them home, they may faint. Here's what the disciples say in verse 4 of Mark chapter 8. How are we supposed to find enough food to feed them here in the wilderness? Again, don't you think like, hey, we just did this a couple weeks ago. Like, let's do this again. This was so much fun to participate in you. Like, how about we just go find to see if anybody even has a crumb that we can multiply into enough food? However, though, Jesus asked them, well, how many loaves do we have? And they say 7. People sit down. Jesus breaks them, distributes them to the crowd. A few small fish were found, so Jesus distributed them. That everybody ate as much as they wanted. The disciples even picked up 7 large baskets of leftover food. And there were about 4,000 men in the crowd that day. And then in verse 10, immediately after this, he got into the boat with his disciples and crossed over the lake again. Man, do we see how much they're in a boat? My goodness. But we see here, okay, so they get back in the boat. All right, and this is what takes place. Verse 13 of Mark chapter 8. So he got back into the boat and left them. And he crossed over to the other side of the lake. But the disciples had forgotten to bring any food. They had only 1 loaf of bread with them in the boat. As they were crossing the lake, Jesus warned them, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. Jesus is referring here to, right above this, in between this, basically the Pharisees are demanding Jesus just to do a miracle. And again, I just did one with a bunch of fish and some bread. But the disciples get back into the boat, and they have no bread. And so what do? At this point, they began to argue with each other because they hadn't brought any bread. Do we think like they're not catching on here? What would you have done if you were in the boat? You would have looked at who? Jesus, and asked what? We don't have any food. Can you do something about that? We were just a part of one miracle. We were just part of another miracle. But let's just be honest here. It's easy, in this case, to be an armchair quarterback. We can look at them and be like, these guys are absolutely idiots. How do they not get the feeding of the 5,000? How do they not get that this man just walked on water? How do they not get that he just did this to another crowd of 4,000 plus? And here we are arguing why we don't have any food, but yet Jesus is sitting here in our presence. It's easy to be an armchair quarterback. Do you think there's other things in life where it's easy to look at it from a different perspective and have a perspective on it like an armchair quarterback? What do you think? Give me some things. Sports, right? Right? When Pastor John watches the Bills, he could have definitely called a better play call than their offensive coordinator. Yes, Pastor John is a better referee as well. Yep. That is true. He's a better ref. Yeah. What are some other things we are armchair quarterbacks at? Driving, that's right. Yeah, we all, right? We all like to yell at other people. What are they doing? Yeah, that's a good one. Give me some other ones. Other people's lives, sure, right? Easy to look at them and be like, Dude, how do they not see that what they're doing, right? Or even just in general? Yeah, definitely. The church, right? Yeah, everybody's got, here's what we should be doing, here's what we should, here's what I think we should do, right? Here's my perspective, here's my opinion. Yeah. If you go on Facebook, everybody's an expert. They all went to law school, they all have political science degrees. They all have some basic understanding of meteorology because they give their expert advice on Facebook constantly. But that's the thing in life. We are often great at looking at other people's lives and saying, don't they get this or don't they see that? But I don't know how well we do that in our own hearts, of examining our own hearts. And again, going back to, do I not understand what Jesus is doing in my life? Am I missing out on what he's doing? We heard a prime example of that shared with Mark Ikes this morning. It'd be so easy to say, I can't believe you didn't register the car. You're an absolute goof. I never would have made that mistake. But no, he's like, see what happened? Yeah, there was some maybe human mistakes, but God was doing something greater. God had a bigger picture in mind through our blunders, that he shows up and does something. And so when we're in a situation or we're going through something in life, Jesus is not in the business of just pulling you out of that. He's not in the business of just saying, you got to get through this. He's using our situations in life to reveal things about who he is and what he's after in our lives, taking us from places of deeper unbelief to belief in our midst. But when we look at the disciples, we can be like, how'd they miss it? Jesus is up there at the right hand of the Father being like, I don't get how you miss this. I don't get how you miss what I'm doing in your life. So this is how Jesus responds to them. They begin to argue about bread. In verse 17, Jesus says this. Jesus knew what they were saying, so he said, why are you arguing about having no bread? Don't you know or even understand yet? Probably said it a little firmly. Oftentimes with Jesus, we see him in movies or videos, and he's portrayed as, talking very eloquently. He's probably a little bit firmer here. Do you guys get this? Are your hearts too hard to take it in? You have eyes, you can't see. You have ears, you can't hear. Don't you remember anything at all? When I fed the 5,000, see how we're connecting Mark 6 and Mark 8 here? When I fed the 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread, how many baskets of leftovers did you pick up afterward? 12, they said. Let's pause here for a moment. This idea here, are your hearts too hard to take it in? Again, we can see connections now, parable of the sower as well here. Your hearts, your eyes, your ears, it's this idea of perceiving. In the Greek, it's to catch an idea, process it, think about it, and then act upon it. Jesus is accusing the disciples of being unable to process and act upon what they had experienced and take it to the next thing. That's what they did. So I ask myself the question, when I get into a situation, if I have something going on in my life, whether it's a miracle or whether it's a great thing or even if it's a bad thing, do I take the time to perceive what's happening? Do I actually take the time to perceive what is taking place? What is Jesus doing in and through this situation? Do I take the time to do that? Do I take the time to observe, to process, to act upon it? Or, in our chronology of life, we just jump and go do the next thing, hoping this problem goes away, hoping it ends, hoping this situation that we just had doesn't happen again. Jesus goes again with them now. He asks them, do you perceive what I just did here? And then he connects now the feeding of the 4,000. And when I fed the 4,000 with 7 loaves, how many large baskets of leftovers did you pick up? 7, they said. Don't you understand yet? He asked them. Don't you get it? Don't you understand? And so if the disciples are having this issue after going through these things, this may sound harsh, but what makes us think that we get it? Now, I'm not saying there aren't situations where we don't get it. We do get it. But I think a lot of times we don't get it. Our hearts are too hard, or we're not even in that wavelength of perceiving what God's doing in our midst. I think for me, the elders, that's one of the biggest challenges we have as elders is seeing what is God doing and how do we go with that. It's not like, oh, what's this cool plan I can think of? And we often do that by observing what's happening around us. Last week, I sent a text message to the elders and said 3 separate people talked to me about the exact same thing. We're all positives, but that affirmed something, but it also said, okay, how do we need to then look at that? How do we need to perceive that? How do we need to act upon that in greater ways? That's what the life of leadership looks like in my own life as well. But you know what? If there was a scorecard up here of my life, I probably would have a lot more misses than I would understanding what Jesus is doing in my midst, saying, I get it. And so for some things, it might be as simple as saying, Lord, help me to understand and see what you're doing in my life today, or in this fill in the blank, or whatever it may be. Help me to see and understand what it is that you're doing. Because ultimately, Jesus wanted them to see, here's a 5,000-piece puzzle. Maybe it's not. It's just 500-piece. Yeah, 500-piece puzzle that I found of the feeding of the 5,000. It's out there somewhere. You can purchase it online. But Jesus wanted them to see something. So let's brainstorm together real quick. Since we are all armchair quarterbacks, whether it's football or driving or somebody else's life, what do we think Jesus wanted the disciples to see by what they went through? Throw some things out. Okay? Power, right? Provider, provision, right? Compassion, yeah, right? Compassion on people who had no food, and Jesus was concerned about them. Sure, right? Power, that Jesus has power over the natural thing, the natural world, right? Power over the wind and waves. Power over the lack of food. That he could provide at a moment's notice. That he was compassionate among people who he probably didn't even know most of their names, but yet he cared for them. What are some other things you think that he wanted the disciples to see? Right? He wanted them to see, wow. As we see another point in the story with Peter, when Peter's called to be a disciple, Jesus says, go back out deeper. And he pulls so much fish in that Peter drops to his knees and says, Lord. Peter saw his own need for something more in his life because of Jesus' miracle. And we can see often through God's working our need for a Savior, or our need to be dependent upon Jesus. Where oftentimes we want to be in control of our situations. We want to be the ones to do the miracle of the loaves and fishes. And the disciples are thinking, look what we just did. But Jesus wanted them to see without him, they were powerless. But with him, as we looked at last week, dunamis power, the power that raised Jesus from the dead, lives inside. Or anything else you think of that you believe they wanted the disciples, that Jesus wanted the disciples to see? Sure, right? Great one, right? How many times do we run somewhere else instead of Jesus when we're in need of something or we have something going on, right? So that's a phenomenal one there, right? All you had to do is you got in the back of the boat. Let's go. Show up. You know, how many times do we do that? Jesus is like, hey, you're striving and struggling, but you just have to ask for some help, some guidance, right? Or saying, Lord, I can't figure this out on my own. Can you help me? It's another great one. So when we are in a situation, you can fill in the blank for your own life. Okay? It's easy to be an armchair quarterback, but it's not easy to do it in our own lives. So this idea of perceive, you have a life event happen, whatever it is, high, low, good, bad. Here's the three things you need to do to perceive what Jesus is doing. Observe, what do I see happening around me? And you can write those things down. What do I see? Interpret, what does that mean? So interpret does not mean assume. Does that make sense? Interpret does not mean assume. Because we often look at things in life and we assume things rather than being the truth. So I have to look at it, maybe ask questions about it. I need to interpret, say, what does this mean? And then lastly, what should I do? Because that word perceive here, Jesus is like, don't you get this? Because Jesus wants them to use this for later points of ministry in their life. He's taking them through this to prepare them to leave the church to them one day. And so he's using this as a training tool for them to grow in their faith, to grow in their belief, to go from places of unbelief to belief in their lives, but also just to have a hands-on training tool. What should I do? Because here's the thing is that faith is always in action, and there's always something that should be done about what you're going through. And maybe it's, I should do this, or you feel a clear call of the Lord to tell you to go do something about your situation or what you're going through. But that's where you have to fill in those blanks in your life of what you're going through, highs and lows, good and bad. But perceiving and taking the time. Because if we don't, oftentimes our situations in life can just harden our hearts even more. And then we continue to miss out on what it is that he's doing in our lives. So this week, if you have a situation or something you're going through, my encouragement is this week, work through this. Maybe bring somebody else into the equation and say, here's what I see, what do you see? That's a great one, right? Especially for those who are armchair quarterbacks about other people's lives. Just get with them, they'll tell you everything. But where do you have them look and see and go through this with you as well? And as lastly, as we close, our big takeaway of what is Jesus saying to you and how will I respond? Repent and believe. Repent and believe. Going from unbelief to areas of belief in our life. What is Jesus saying to you through this sermon this morning, through this text of Mark 6 and Mark chapter 8? We see dots connect. And how will you respond? This idea of believe is an action word. It's not just upstairs, but it's lived out in our lives by how we function from there.